I never thought that the most painful blow of my life would come not from illness or death, but from the mouth of my own daughter. I was sitting at the back of the room, surrounded by golden balloons and cheerful music, when I watched her radiantly ascend the stage in her blue dress to give her acceptance speech. It was her 35th birthday, and I naively expected to hear at least one word of gratitude. Just one. But what came out of her lips was a dagger that pierced me without warning. She hugged her mother-in-law tightly, lifted her from her seat, and, with the microphone in her hand, said, "This is the only mother who matters to me." The entire room erupted in applause. I saw the smiles, the camera flashes, the shining eyes of the guests. And then, as if that weren't enough, she turned to me and added in that firm voice she had shouted to me so many times in private, "You can go now." I felt the air escape from my lungs. My hands trembled over my bag as I tried to hold on to what dignity I had left. No one was looking at me. No one was standing up for me. It was as if I had suddenly been erased from history. I stood up slowly, my knees heavy, while my daughter watched me with that mixture of contempt and triumph I'd seen so often in her eyes. But just as I took the first step toward the exit, someone else stood up. My daughter-in-law. But before I continue, I wanted to know if you've already subscribed to the channel and also liked the video. This helps me see that you support me and like my stories. Now, let's continue. My daughter-in-law walked firmly onto the stage, took the microphone from my daughter's hands, and with a trembling but determined voice, said something that chilled the blood of everyone present. "I can't stay silent. Today is your birthday, and yes, you deserve to celebrate, but you also deserve to hear the truth." The silence became so dense that not even the background music dared to continue. The guests looked at each other restlessly, with that unease that only appears when they sense something sacred is about to be broken. My daughter, confused, tried to reclaim the microphone, but my daughter-in-law held it with both hands as if it cost her her life. "You've always looked down on me," she continued. "You've made me feel less than. You've treated me as if I weren't worthy of being by your side. But you know what? The real mother here isn't the one who applauds your vanities, or the one who smiles in front of the cameras. The real mother is the one who was with you since you were born, the one who took care of you, the one who sacrificed her life for you. And that woman is standing there while you throw her out of your party like garbage." A murmur of astonishment ran through the room. I, paralyzed, could hardly believe what I was hearing. My daughter-in-law, whom I had always seen as distant, as someone oblivious to my struggles, was the only one who dared to say out loud what no one else wanted to acknowledge. My daughter paled, tried to laugh it off, to pretend this was a misunderstanding. "What are you saying?" she stammered. "This isn't the time for your dramatics." But the damage was done. The gaze was no longer on her, but on me. For the first time in many years, people looked at me straight in the eye as if they remembered I existed, that I was more than a shadow in my daughter's life. I don't know how long that silence lasted. For me, it felt eternal. I only heard the strong, desperate beat of my heart pounding in my temples, and then I understood. That public humiliation that I had believed to be my end was actually the beginning. I left the living room that night with my head held high and my eyes dry. No tears could clean the wound, but a decision was beginning to form inside me. Something had ignited inside me. I couldn't continue allowing my daughter, the child for whom I had given my life, to destroy me over and over again. The cold of the night hit me in the face as I walked through the door. I hugged myself and remembered every sacrifice. The sleepless nights, caring for her when she was sick, the times I gave up my own dreams to support hers, the years of silence so as not to embarrass her in front of anyone. All of that reduced to a gesture, a few words of contempt into a microphone. As I walked home, I knew nothing would ever be the same. My daughter had sealed our fate with those words. But my daughter-in-law, with her unexpected confession, had also opened a crack in the perfect facade of that family. A crack I planned to widen until everything collapsed, because if she had had the courage to speak, I would have the courage to act. That night, alone in front of the mirror, I quietly repeated the words I didn't dare say in the living room. I'm not going to leave. I'm not going to give up. And that's how it all began. People often believe that the love between a mother and daughter is indestructible, like a bond that neither time nor circumstances can break. I believed it too. Perhaps that's why the pain I feel now is so unbearable, because I gave myself over completely to a lie that slowly crumbled. When I think about my daughter's early years, my memory is tinged with tenderness. I remember her as a newborn, with those big dark eyes that looked at me as if I were her entire world. I spent hours holding her in my arms, singing improvised lullabies while exhaustion burned my back. I didn't care. In every smile, in every first babble, I found a reason to keep breathing. I didn't have a happy childhood. I grew up in a house where the absence of love was the norm. My sickly mother could barely handle me, and my father, with his violent temper, took his frustration out on us. I swore that with my daughter, it would be different. I swore I would give her everything I didn't have: a safe home, a warm hug, a refuge where she could grow up without fear. At first I succeeded, but over time the roots of that promise began to crack. Her father, my husband, was never an easy man. He was hardworking, yes, but also proud and distant. He barely paid attention to the daily details I valued so much. For him, raising a daughter was a secondary task, a duty that fell entirely in my hands. He became the judge and executioner of my efforts. If she cried, it was my fault. If she fell ill, I hadn't taken good care of her. If she rebelled, it was because I'd been too soft. And she, my little girl, absorbed every word. She grew up hearing from her father that I wasn't enough, that I lacked character, that I wasn't up to his standards. At first, he stood up for me, but over the years, he stopped. It was easier to join him than to stay by my side. I remember one afternoon, when she was barely 12 years old. I had cooked her favorite dish to cheer her up after a difficult exam. When I set the table for her, she looked at me with disdain and said, "Dad says you cook badly." I froze, the knife still in my hand. I asked her if she thought that too, and her response was a shrug, as if my efforts were worthless. That day, I understood that the poison of contempt had already taken root in her heart. Her teenage years were even crueler. Every time we argued, she repeated phrases that weren't her own. They were echoes of her father, and later of her husband's family. "You're old-fashioned, you're a nuisance, you never gave me what I needed." And instead of confronting her, I remained silent. I was afraid of losing her. I believed that if I endured, if I held on, one day she would understand everything I did for her. But that day never came. The appearance of her mother-in-law sealed my place in her life. That shrewd woman with a gift for charming people won her over with attentions and flattery that I never knew how to bestow in such a showy way. She had money, connections, and sweet words that sounded like music to ears eager for recognition. My daughter began to compare me to her, to see in that woman what I couldn't offer, and each comparison left me further relegated, smaller, more invisible. Little by little, I began to notice that family invitations were dwindling, that the photos I shared on social media never included me, that in conversations I was merely a footnote, an uncomfortable memory I preferred to hide. When did I lose my daughter? That's the question that keeps me awake at night. Perhaps it was the day I accepted silence instead of demanding respect. Perhaps it was when I preferred to remain silent rather than confront her father. Or maybe it began before then, ever since the pain of my own childhood prevented me from teaching her to love me. The truth is that as she grew, I faded away, and by the time I wanted to react, it was too late. She had replaced me. I had found in another woman the maternal figure I always dreamed of being for her. And yet, here I am. Despite everything, I still feel love. A wounded, mutilated, but still alive love. Because even though she pointed me out in public, even though she kicked me out of her party, even though she told me to leave, I'm still her mother. And a mother's heart doesn't obey logic, but an instinct that condemns her to love even those who hurt her. That is my greatest weakness and at the same time my greatest strength. Because that love doesn't mean resignation. On the contrary, it means that I won't give up. That even if my daughter denies me, I have the right to the truth.
And if she chose to forget it, I will make it my mission to remind her, even if it hurts. What happened on her birthday wasn't an accident. It was the fruit of years of silence and contempt. But it was also the beginning of something new. Because now I know I'm not willing to continue living in the shadows. If my daughter wants to bury me alive, she will have to see how from that grave I rise and return every word, every gesture, every scorn. And I won't do it with shouts or violence. I'll do it with the truth. That truth they fear, that no one expects. And that will be my greatest revenge. The silences. If I had to describe my life in one word, that would be the most accurate. Because what destroyed my relationship with my daughter wasn't just the yelling, the arguments, or the contempt. It was the prolonged silences, laden with an invisible poison that accumulated day after day until it suffocated me. At home, my husband was the master of the word, and I learned too early that contradicting him was useless. He imposed his version of life, and we, both my daughter and I, had to accept it. The terrible thing is that over the years, she not only accepted him, she admired him. He became her role model, her reference point. I, on the other hand, was relegated to the role of a secondary figure, a muted backdrop. I remember one dinner in particular. My daughter was probably 16. The three of us were at the table, and she excitedly mentioned that she wanted to study music. She had talent. From a young age, she displayed a sweet voice and a keen ear. I encouraged her. I told her she should follow her dreams, but her father laughed scornfully. "Music," he said, in that voice that froze the air. "Music doesn't fill the table. That's a mediocre thing. You'll study law like your cousin." I tried to intervene. "Let her choose. Don't force her." He glared at me, and before I could continue, my daughter interrupted. "Dad's right. You don't understand." And silence fell upon me, heavy as a wall. That was just one example among many. Every time I tried to offer support, my voice was buried beneath the echo of hers. She grew up convinced that my words were worthless. She learned that her father had the absolute truth and that I was merely a murmur, background noise that could be ignored. But over time, that role was filled by someone else, her mother-in-law. When she met her future husband, I thought life would give her a new direction, perhaps the opportunity to find a love that would soften her. However, what I found was another long shadow that displaced me even further. Her husband's mother presented herself as a confident, elegant, charming woman. From the first moment, my daughter was smitten with her. I remember her first visit to our house. The woman arrived with a bouquet of flowers and sweet words that rang false to me from the start. Even so, my daughter hugged her enthusiastically and, as soon as she left, commented, "Did you see how incredible she is? She understands me like no one else." I smiled, even though something inside was tearing at me. That, like no one else, was a cruel reminder that I had never known how to fill the space she needed. The silences became even more painful after that day. My daughter began spending more time with her mother-in-law than with me. She consulted her first with any important decision. Whenever I had problems, I ran to her for advice. I stayed on the sidelines, hoping in vain that she would include me, that she would let me be a part of it. But all I received were cold silences, glances that passed by, and short phrases that ended the conversation. The humiliations came later, almost without me realizing it. loud comments in front of other people. My mother-in-law always has the right words. You wouldn't understand, Mom. She knows how to throw a party, unlike you.
I feel more like her daughter than yours. Each phrase was a knife in my throat, and I swallowed it silently. I didn't want to confront her, didn't want to push her away any further. I believed that if I endured, if I stayed close, one day she would open her eyes. But time proved me wrong. The silence became a habit. I visited her and she barely spoke to me. I accompanied her to her events and relegated myself to a corner. In family photos, I was the figure cut off at the edges. I didn't even realize that I was slowly being erased, until it became clear that I was an extra in my own life. The worst part was that I started to believe her. There came a point where I thought to myself that I didn't deserve to be there, that perhaps it was true that I hadn't been enough, that my mistakes had outweighed my successes. I sank into a quiet sadness, into a bitter acceptance that my place had been taken and that no one, not even my daughter, would fight to give it back to me. But what happened on her birthday changed something inside me. When she told me in front of everyone that I could go, the silence was broken. It was as if I was hit head-on by the evidence of what I had tolerated for years. And then my daughter-in-law appeared unexpectedly, with a voice that challenged that habit of silence. She spoke when I had already forgotten how. In that instant, I understood something crucial. My silences had been my prison. I had locked myself in them, believing that keeping quiet was the way to keep my daughter. But keeping quiet only stripped me of my dignity. Now I knew that if I wanted to recover what was left of me, I had to speak. Even if no one wanted to listen, even if it hurt, I had to do it. The weight of silence had crushed me for decades, but now, finally, I was ready to break them. And I would do it with the truth. Even if that truth set fire to everything my daughter had built. I will never forget the expression on my daughter's face when my daughter-in-law snatched the microphone from her that night. She, accustomed to being the center of attention, to no one contradicting her, froze. For a second, I thought my daughter-in-law would simply make a banal comment, perhaps a forced compliment. But what came out of her mouth was a torrent of truths no one expected, and each word was a whiplash that resonated against the walls of the room. "Today is your birthday," my daughter-in-law said, her voice trembling but firm. "And it's right that you receive love. But it's also right that you face what you've wanted to hide for so long." The murmur among the guests stopped. Glasses were left half-filled, laughter caught in the throats of many. I felt my heart race as if it were trying to burst out of my chest. Something big was about to happen. And for the first time, I wasn't the protagonist of the humiliation, but a witness to a truth that dragged me from the shadows to the light. My daughter tried to regain control. She approached her with a twitchy smile. "What are you saying? Don't make a drama out of my party." But my daughter-in-law didn't stop. I saw her grip the microphone with both hands as if she were holding a gun. "Your mother gave you everything she had," she continued. "And you, instead of thanking her, have made her your target of scorn. You have allowed others to humiliate her and joined in that mockery as if it were a sport. Do you know what it's like to see a mother leave your house crying because you treated her like a stranger? I know because I've seen it." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. My throat closed. I could barely breathe. I hadn't expected that defense. I had never imagined that someone, least of all my daughter-in-law, would have the courage to expose in front of everyone what I had suffered in silence. My daughter, nervous, looked at the guests. "Don't pay attention to her," she said with a forced laugh. "She always exaggerates." But my daughter-in-law took a step forward and lowered her voice, as if speaking directly to her. "It's not an exaggeration. It's the truth you've hidden beneath your parties and your applause." The tension became unbearable. I could see my daughter's mother-in-law sitting upright in her chair, her lips pursed, her gaze furious. She couldn't bear to see her kingdom of perfection shaken, and my daughter, seeing herself exposed, began to lose control. "Shut up now," she yelled. "This isn't your moment."
My daughter-in-law looked at her calmly, and it was that calmness that made her tremble even more. "No, this isn't my moment," she replied. "It's your mother's. The one you took from her years ago." The words hung in the air like a verdict. I felt my legs tremble, not from weakness, but from a strength I couldn't remember feeling in a long time. It was as if my daughter-in-law's voice had restored the dignity I had buried within me. The guests didn't know where to look. Some watched me with compassion, others with shame, others with a mixture of surprise and respect. No one dared to applaud this time. It was too real, too raw. My daughter, on the other hand, was falling apart. I saw her face change from anger to humiliation, from arrogance to despair. She wasn't prepared for anyone to confront her, much less in front of everyone. I had always lived believing I could manage appearances, that with a fake smile I could hide the rot within. But that night the masks shattered. I wanted to speak, I wanted to seize that moment to say what I had bottled up for years, but I held back. It wasn't my turn yet. Sometimes the greatest act of power is silence, well used. My daughter-in-law had lit the fuse, and I had to wait for the exact moment for the explosion to become my weapon. My daughter tried to compose herself and, in a desperate attempt, hugged her mother-in-law in front of everyone. "She's the mother I always wanted," she said, almost shouting. "I don't need anything else." But the phrase sounded hollow, empty. No one believed her because, after what my daughter-in-law had revealed, everyone knew it was nothing more than a childish defense, a last-ditch effort before sinking. I watched her in silence, with a mixture of pain and compassion. On the one hand, she was still my daughter, the girl I had once carried in my arms and lulled to sleep on feverish nights. But on the other hand, I no longer recognized her. She was a woman consumed by her own pride, unable to see beyond her ego. That night, I knew that the war between us was no longer invisible. It was now public. And in a public war, it's not the one who shouts the loudest who wins, but the one who knows how to wait and strike at the right moment. My daughter-in-law looked at me from the stage, and in her eyes I saw something I'd never seen before. Complicity. As if she were telling me wordlessly that I wasn't alone, that there was someone willing to bear witness to what I had experienced. And then I understood that this birthday, which had begun as my condemnation, had become my opportunity. Because my daughter-in-law's words weren't the end of the humiliation, but the beginning of my revenge. That night, after the birthday, I returned home with my body exhausted and my heart wounded, but also with my mind fired up. My daughter-in-law's words had opened a crack in the facade my daughter had built for years, and as I took off my dress and let my hair down in front of the mirror, memories began to fall upon me like stones. Scenes from a past that never healed its wounds, episodes that had marked me like invisible scars. I close my eyes and see her as a little girl, barely 5 years old, running toward me with a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked in the garden. "You are the best mom in the world," she told me then, with a smile that lit up my soul. That memory haunts me because it shows me that there was a time when I really meant everything to her. And it hurts to wonder when I stopped being that way. As the years went by, the sweet gestures faded. I remember her adolescence as a particularly cruel time. There were days when she would come home from school, throw her backpack on the couch, and walk right past me, without saying hello, without looking at me. I would try to approach her, ask how she'd been, if she needed anything. She would respond with monosyllables, or with that silence that hurt more than any insult. One day, when I was 15, we argued because she'd arrived late. I was worried. I waited up for her with the table set. When she came in, I asked her to explain where she'd been. She looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and contempt and said, "You're nobody to ask me." That sentence broke me in two. It wasn't just a teenage rebellion. It was a conscious rejection, a direct cut from my role as a mother. That night I cried, in silence, with the table set and the food still cold on the plates. Another episode is etched into my skin like a burn. It was at her high school graduation. I'd worked so hard to prepare everything: her dress, the dinner, the details I thought would make her happy. And at the end of the event, when the organizers asked the students to come up on stage with their parents, she looked for her father first. I went up too, but when I tried to take his hand, he discreetly pulled it away. No one noticed, except me. And that small gesture broke my heart. It was as if she wanted to erase me even from the photos that would immortalize her at that important moment. The following years were a collection of small and large wounds. I remember going to her house when she was already living with her husband. She brought a dessert she had lovingly prepared, thinking it would cheer him up. As soon as she opened the door, she looked me up and down and said, "Oh, Mom, don't you get tired of acting so good? Nobody here needs your things." And she took the tray from my hands without looking me in the eye. I stood in the hallway with a frozen smile as I listened to her say to her mother-in-law in the kitchen, "Look how she insists on wanting to stand out." I remember that phrase as if it were yesterday. Each wound built a wall between us. I tried to tear it down with patience, with love, with resigned silences. But my daughter raised new stones with each disdain. There came a point where I understood that she didn't want reconciliation, that her choice was clear. She had decided to give another woman the place that belonged to me, and the worst part was that she did it with a cruelty that seemed to seek my total surrender. During those lonely nights, I wondered if I had failed as a mother. If perhaps I didn't give her enough, or if I overprotected her too much. Guilt devoured me. I thought that my own past, my broken childhood, had marked the way I raised her. Perhaps, without realizing it, I had suffocated her with my fears, and she found in her mother-in-law the free and secure figure that I could never be. But then I remembered everything I sacrificed: the years of work, the sleepless nights, the dreams I kept in a drawer so she could fulfill hers. And I understood that, no, it hadn't been a lack of love or dedication. The problem was that in her ambition for recognition, she chose to deny her roots. I was the uncomfortable part of her story, the one she preferred to hide in order to shine in front of others. Those open wounds never healed, and on her birthday, they all bled at the same time. When she told me in front of everyone that I could go, it wasn't just a humiliation. It was the cruel summary of years of accumulated contempt. But the difference now was that I wasn't going to keep quiet anymore, because those wounds, although they hurt, had also made me strong. Every hidden tear, every swallowed insult, every avoided glance had forged me like iron, and if my daughter thought I could still break, she was wrong. Now I was the one willing to break the silence, to raise my voice, to use the truth as a weapon. That night, I promised myself there would be no more wasted tears. The wounds would still be there, yes, but they wouldn't be signs of defeat. They would be my battle scars, and with them, I would march toward the battlefield that awaited me, that of the truth that had yet to be revealed. Pain teaches, but humiliation sharpens. And after that party, when I heard my daughter tell me in public that I could go, I understood that the time had come to transform my scars into weapons. I could no longer expect gratitude where there was only contempt. I had remained silent for too long. I had endured slights that left me marked like red-hot iron. But that night, with my daughter-in-law's words echoing in my mind, I decided I would no longer be a victim. A plan began to silently germinate. It wasn't the first time I thought about defending myself, but I always lacked the courage. This time, however, rage was my driving force. I was no longer seeking reconciliation or tenderness. I was seeking justice. The first thing I did was open the drawers of my memory, those I had kept closed for fear of what I might find. I remembered that my husband, before dying, had left a trail of financial secrets, dubious investments, and documents that he always jealously concealed. For years I preferred not to look, not to ask, because I told myself it was a man's thing. But now I understood that those papers could be my most powerful weapon. I began visiting the office that had been abandoned in the house. The smell of dust and old paper accompanied me as I looked through yellowed folders, sealed envelopes, and contracts I had never dared to read. At first, I felt lost, like an intruder in my own home. But with patience, I deciphered every line, every number, every signature. I discovered that my husband had made deals with my daughter's in-laws, financial favors that tied our destinies closer than I would have liked. And therein lay the irony. The mother-in-law she now revered owed me more than she would have ever admitted. This was dynamite, and I knew it as soon as I read it. I didn't want to rush into anything. I quietly sought help. I contacted a trusted old friend, a retired lawyer who had always respected me. I took the documents to him and asked him to explain what they really meant. I remember him staring at me wide-eyed. "Do you have any idea what you're keeping in here?" he said. "With this, you could bring down your daughter, her husband, and even the in-laws." I felt a chill, not because I was scared, but because for the first time I understood that I had the power in my hands. Then I began to plot my strategy. I kept copies of everything, protected them in different places, and even gave my lawyer a sealed envelope with clear instructions in case something happened to me. It wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. I knew my daughter's arrogance and her mother-in-law's cunning all too well. If they discovered what I knew, they wouldn't hesitate to attack me with everything they had. Meanwhile, in public, I continued to play the role of the fragile, almost invisible mother. I attended family gatherings. I smiled when I should have. I kept my head down so as not to arouse suspicion. No one imagined that behind that facade, every gesture, every word, every glance was being calculated. The key to everything was patience. I knew my daughter would make mistakes. Her arrogance made her careless, and her need to prove she didn't need me would lead her onto dangerous ground. I just had to wait for the right moment to reveal what I had in my hands. At night, as I went over my plan again and again, I found myself thinking about the past. How had we gotten here? How had that little girl who hugged me while I slept become a woman capable of dismissing me from her life as if I were a nuisance? Sometimes the pain almost made me waver, but then I remembered every slight, every look of superiority, and my resolve steeled. I also thought a lot about my daughter-in-law. Her bravery at the birthday party had been the spark that lit the fuse of my plan. I wondered what motivated her to speak that way. If she did it for me, or because she had also suffered at the hands of my daughter. I didn't know, but I was sure of one thing. That woman, who at first seemed like a stranger, could be an unexpected ally. The plan wasn't just about exposing the economic and social truth about my daughter and her mother-in-law. It wasn't any bigger. I wanted to dismantle the facade of perfection they had built at the cost of my humiliation. I wanted everyone, absolutely everyone, to see what lay behind that applause, those fake smiles and those empty speeches. Once, in front of the mirror, I dared to speak out loud, as if rehearsing for the day of my revelation. "I don't want your affection," I said, imagining my daughter standing before me. "I don't need your applause. All I demand is respect. And if you don't know how to give it to me, I'll snatch it away with the truth." That mirror was my accomplice for weeks. I practiced words, gestures, even silences. I wouldn't improvise. When the time came, every sentence had to be precise. Every pause had to sink her deeper into her own lie. And while everything was brewing in the shadows, I smiled in public, accepted the slights, pretended not to hear the mockery. Inside, however, I repeated over and over, "Wait, Isabel, wait. Your time will come." That moment was closer than anyone could imagine. There are conversations a mother would never want to have with her daughter. For years, I dreamed of sitting face to face, talking without shouting or reproaches, and perhaps crying together to heal the wounds we carried. But when I finally mustered the courage to seek her out, I realized that all I would find was a cruel mirror. My daughter, reflecting in her harshness and contempt the worst of her father and the woman she now calls mother. I invited her to my house, to the living room where we had so often shared simple birthdays, afternoons of homework, and Sunday movies. She arrived late, as always, with a haughty expression and expensive perfume permeating every corner. She didn't even apologize. She sat on the sofa as if she weren't a guest, but the owner, and crossed her legs with an air that I found unbearable. "What do you want now, Mom?" she asked me, in that impatient tone that so often stabbed me like a needle in the chest. "I'm busy." I looked at her in silence for a few seconds. Her features held so much of me that it hurt. The same dark hair, the same high forehead, but in her eyes there was no tenderness or recognition, only coldness. "I wanted to talk to you," I said finally, "not as enemies, but as mother and daughter." She laughed, a dry laugh that tore at me from the inside. Mother and daughter. We stopped being that a long time ago. I bit my lip. I didn't want to cry, not in front of her. "Why, daughter? Why do you hate me so much?" Her response was a look filled with resentment. "Because you were never enough, always small, always dull, always begging for a place. Dad was right, you were a nuisance, and I didn't want to be like you." I felt the blow like a sledgehammer to the stomach. Hearing the same words his father had hurled at me so many times from his mouth was unbearable. It was like reliving all the years of humiliation, but amplified by the voice of my own flesh and blood. "Everything I did was for you," I barely whispered. "I gave up my dreams, my life, so you could have what I didn't have." "And what good did it do?" He interrupted me. "You never gave me what I needed. Honestly, pride. I found it with my grandmother-in-law. She taught me to be strong, to not depend on anyone, to have a presence. You, on the other hand, were always everyone's shadow." Her words made me tremble, but they also fired me up. "Presence," I said, raising my voice. "You call presence trampling on your mother, erasing your history? That woman wasn't with you through the feverish nights. She didn't walk with you to school in the rain. She didn't sell her things to buy your books. That woman only appeared when you were already made, when it was easy to cling to your pride." She looked away uncomfortably for the first time, but her pride wouldn't let her give in. "What's done is done. You chose to be invisible. Don't blame me for having found another figure that better represented me." I froze. It was confirmation that I had lost her, that no words, no memories, no sacrifice could reverse the wall I'd built between us. However, something changed in me at that moment. I no longer felt sadness. I felt anger. A cold, calculated anger that didn't lead me to scream or plead, but to the certainty that I had to move forward with my plan. She had made her decision, to renounce me. I would make mine, to show her that not everything in life can be erased or replaced.
"Okay," I said, standing up. "If that's what you think, then there's nothing more to talk about." She smiled with that triumphant smile I knew all too well. "You finally understand." But she didn't understand anything, because while she thought she'd defeated me, I already had in my hands the pieces that would bring down the castle of arrogance she'd built with her mother-in-law. I walked her to the door. Before leaving, she turned and gave me one last stab. "When I talk about my mother, I don't think of you. Get used to it." I closed the door slowly, my heart burning, and leaned against the wood and let out a deep sigh. I didn't cry, not anymore, because instead of tears, what coursed through me was a new energy, an absolute certainty. She had given me the reason not to stop. In that moment, I understood that my daughter had become the mirror of everything I hated: her father's arrogance, her mother-in-law's manipulation, the coldness of misunderstood power. And I would no longer try to save her from herself. My mission now was another, to tear that mirror away from her and show it to her in front of everyone, even if it was the last thing I did. Because if she wanted to see me as a shadow, she would learn that shadows also know how to envelop everything, even drowning out the light that believes itself eternal. Just when I thought it would all end in that private confrontation with my daughter-in-law's unexpected voice appeared again. She, who had lit the first spark on that birthday, returned with even greater force. And this time she didn't just speak for me, she spoke against the entire facade my daughter and her mother-in-law had built for years.
It happened at one of those family gatherings that seemed designed to present a perfect portrait. It was my daughter and her husband's wedding anniversary, and the hall was decorated with a luxury bordering on ostentatious. Guests, imported flowers, cameras capturing every gesture. I had decided to attend, not out of affection, but because I knew such occasions were the ideal setting for masks to crack. And I wasn't wrong. My daughter's mother-in-law, dressed in an elegant suit and a rehearsed smile, strutted like a queen among those present. My daughter followed her like a satellite, celebrating every word, every gesture, as if I were the only sun that illuminated her life. I sat in an invisible corner, as usual, but with my eyes wide open. I waited. It was then that my daughter-in-law, dressed simply but with the dignity of someone who needed no adornment, stood up from her table. Her clear voice called for silence. No one understood what was about to happen, but everyone obeyed. Some things must be said. She began, because one cannot live forever behind appearances. A murmur of discomfort ran through the room. My daughter-in-law raised her eyebrows. Surprised, my daughter paled, perhaps remembering the scene from her birthday. I, on the other hand, leaned forward with my heart pounding. I knew something big was about to explode. You, my daughter-in-law continued, looking directly at her mother-in-law, have played for years at being the perfect mother, the blameless woman, the figure everyone should admire. But I know what you are hiding. I know about the accounts you moved in silence, the shady business dealings into which you dragged your son and, consequently, my husband. And I also know how you manipulated my sister-in-law into believing you were the only mother she deserved. A frozen silence filled the room. I saw the mother-in-law's smile crack, her face tighten with suppressed fury. My daughter, desperate, tried to interrupt her. Enough already. What are you trying to achieve with all this? It's ridiculous. But my daughter-in-law didn't stop. What I want is the truth. Or do you want me to show you the documents I have? Because I have them. I've seen transfers, contracts with false names, agreements signed behind the family's back. The guests began to murmur. Some discreetly took out their phones. Others exchanged astonished glances. The perfect scene crumbled like a house of cards under an unexpected breeze. I watched everything with a mixture of vertigo and satisfaction. I hadn't lifted a finger, but my daughter-in-law was fighting the battle I had silently planned. It was as if fate had placed in my path an ally I'd never sought, someone who had also suffered under that family's manipulations and was no longer willing to remain silent. The mother-in-law finally stood up. Her voice, thick with anger, echoed in the room. This is slander, a lie invented to destroy me. But her hands were trembling. That trembling was the clearest confession. She was afraid. My daughter ran to her, hugged her in front of everyone as if with that gesture she could protect her. Don't pay attention to her, she screamed. It's just envy, a trap. However, her words no longer carried the same weight. No one listened to her with credibility. The shadow of doubt had fallen over her impeccable stage, and in those environments, a vast shadow that could extinguish all the lights. I, sitting silently, let everything happen. I didn't need to intervene. It was like contemplating a chessboard where, without moving my pieces, I watched the enemy's pieces fall, one by one. When she finished, my daughter-in-law put down the microphone and left the room. She didn't meet my gaze. She didn't wait for applause or support. She simply walked away with the serenity of someone who has fulfilled her conscience. When the door closed behind her, chaos erupted. Guests murmured. Others left with quick excuses, journalists improvising headlines in their heads. The mother-in-law tried to compose herself, but it was too late. Her image of perfection had been tarnished. And my daughter, her eyes glassy with rage, looked at me as if it were all my fault. In her gaze I read hatred, a hatred so deep it chilled my blood. But I also saw something else. Fear. Because even if she wouldn't admit it, I knew my daughter-in-law's words had merit. And what she didn't know was that I, too, was keeping documents, evidence, secrets that could finally sink her. That night when I returned home, I kept thinking about my daughter-in-law's courage. She had taken a step I hadn't yet dared to take. I wondered if she had done it solely out of personal revenge, or if in some way she had also done it for me. It didn't matter. The truth is that her voice opened a door that no one can now close. The family war was no longer a private whisper. Now it was exposed, bleeding out in front of everyone. And I, who had lived for years under the weight of silence, understood that my moment was near, because when the truth begins to emerge, there is no one who can stop it. All my life, I feared public scenes. I was always the woman who remained on the sidelines, the one who avoided the center of attention, the one who preferred to support others from the shadows instead of claiming my own space. But that night, as I entered the room packed with business partners, friends, and relatives, I knew I could no longer hide. The murmur was deafening, a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Since my daughter-in-law's confession weeks before, nothing had been the same. Everyone was waiting for explanations. Everyone wanted to see how this drama, which no one could ignore, would end. And amidst those expectant glances, I found myself standing on a platform with a folder under my arm that weighed more than any memory. That folder contained not only papers, but decades of silences, humiliations, and wounds that now became my only language for justice. I took a deep breath and looked around. I saw my daughter rigid in her seat, her eyes cold as knives and her body tense like a bow about to break. Beside her, her mother-in-law stood with a stony face, trying to project dignity, although I noticed a slight tremor in her hands. Both faces reminded me of years of contempt, the gestures of superiority, the looks that reduced me to a shadow, the words that condemned me to oblivion. And there they were, exposed before an audience that was beginning to suspect that this family perfection was nothing more than a facade. I opened the folder, and the sound of the paper rustling was like a gunshot piercing the silence. "I've been silent for too long," I said in a firm voice, although inside my guts were trembling. "I remained silent when my husband humiliated me, when my daughter pushed me away, when this family reduced me to nothing. I remained silent out of love, out of fear, and out of habit. But no longer. Today I came to speak, and what I'm about to say will forever change the way you view those who have scorned me." The tension could have been cut with a knife. Some heads leaned forward in expectation, others discreetly retreated, fearing the looming scandal. Calmly, I unfolded the documents. They weren't rumors, they weren't insinuations. They were contracts, transfers, bank records. My husband's inheritance and the financial dealings of my daughter's mother-in-law's family were tainted with irregularities. I had discovered this among dusty papers that no one expected me to review, but there it was. The truth they had hidden for years, now my sword. My daughter stood up abruptly, her voice thick with fury. "Lie. All of this is a lie." I looked at her without blinking and held up one of the documents. "Lie. Then explain to them why your signature appears here, authorizing transactions you never declared. Explain to them, not to me, why you agreed to cover for your father when he asked you to sign in his place." The color drained from her face. Her entire body trembled. For an instant, her lips moved, but no words came out. The audience understood. Doubt had already been planted, and doubt, when it sets in, is more destructive than any scream. The mother-in-law stood up haughtily, her voice thick with contempt. "This is a setup," she said, "a personal vendetta by a resentful woman." Then I pointed at her, with the calmness of someone who knows she's already won. "If it were a setup, why are your hands shaking?" Murmurs broke out among those present. Some exclaimed in surprise, others exchanged incredulous glances. The perfect image of that woman crumbled in a matter of seconds.
It no longer mattered what I said. The trembling of her hands spoke louder than her voice. I paused for a few seconds of silence, enough for the tension to grow unbearably. Then I added, I'm not looking for compassion or gratuitous revenge. All I want is for the truth to come out. And here it is. In these papers that will be validated by notaries. In these documents that cannot be erased or ignored. They tried to erase me, but memory cannot be erased. And today, that memory lays them bare in front of everyone. The notaries present confirmed the authenticity of the documents. The partners, outraged, began to murmur among themselves. Some even left the room in a hurry. Those who remained looked at my daughter with a mixture of contempt and disappointment. She collapsed in her chair, her eyes brimming with tears that were not of regret, but of rage. The mother-in-law, on the other hand, tried to hold her head high, but fear shone in her eyes. She knew the mask had fallen. I closed the folder and placed it on the table with a thud, as if to say, everything has been said. I didn't need to scream. My calm, measured voice was more devastating than her cries of despair. I walked toward the exit as the room shook with murmurs, accusing glances, and the echo of a truth that no one could now stop. Before leaving, I turned one last time. I looked at my daughter curled up in her seat, her face buried in her hands. My voice was clear, firm, definitive. I didn't leave, and I never will. I am your mother, even if you deny me, even if you hate me. And my voice will always haunt you. And then I walked through the door. Outside, the night was cold, but a flame burned in my chest that would never go out. It wasn't joy I felt, nor was it peace. It was justice. A justice that had taken years to arrive, but that finally emerged with the force of thunder. The night after the public trial was the first in many years that I slept without a commotion. I didn't dream of screams or scorn or scenes in which my daughter turned her back on me. I didn't dream of anything, and that emptiness was more restorative than any illusion. When I woke up, however, I realized there was still one more step to take. I had unmasked my daughter and her mother-in-law. I had returned the truth to the place from which it had been torn from me. But I still had to decide what I would do with what remained. My inheritance, my name, my legacy. For decades, I believed the assets were something distant from me, that everything belonged to my husband, that I was merely the invisible guardian keeping them in order. But in my hands were now the deeds, the accounts, the contracts that proved that a large part of that fortune, directly or indirectly, belonged to me. And yet, what I valued most wasn't the money. It was the opportunity to decide. That decision that had been denied to me my entire life was finally mine. I didn't want to repeat history. I didn't want to perpetuate the chain of arrogance and contempt that had destroyed my family. If my daughter had disowned me as her mother, I would disown her as her heir. I met with my lawyer in his office. He placed on the table a draft of the will we had already worked on in secret weeks before. I read it slowly, savoring every word. It clearly stated that my daughter was excluded from the inheritance, that she wouldn't receive a single cent or a single piece of property. Everything would go to a fund for young orphans and women victims of violence. A smaller but significant portion would go to my daughter-in-law, the only one who had had the courage to speak out when everyone else remained silent. My lawyer looked at me cautiously, as if afraid I would change my mind. "Are you completely sure?" he asked. I nodded firmly, more certain than I had been of anything in my life.
My grandchildren will have to forge their own path without depending on a surname, and my daughter will learn, even if it's too late, that not everything in this life can be bought with arrogance. I signed the document with a calmness that surprised me. It was like closing a circle that had been open for decades, as if with that signature I had once and for all buried the shadow of my husband and the wound my daughter had left me. For the first time, I felt that I wasn't the one obeying, but the one deciding. The following days were a whirlwind of rumors. The news quickly leaked out. The widow had disinherited her only daughter. The local newspapers published it, some with scandalous headlines, others with an almost poetic tone. Society, which had so applauded my daughter's union with her perfect mother-in-law, now reveled in the fall of her mask. And amid all this commotion, I remained calm, watching from my window as the storm raged outside. The reaction was not long in coming. One afternoon, my daughter burst into my house unannounced. She was distraught, her eyes red from crying or screaming, I don't know. She confronted me in the living room with the fury of someone who feels everything she had is slipping through her fingers. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed at me. "I'm your daughter. Your only daughter." I looked at her calmly. "Daughter, do you remember that night you said in front of everyone that I could go now? That day it was you who gave up on me." Her lips trembled. She tried to reply but couldn't find the words. I continued speaking, this time without trembling, without fear. "You had me your whole life and you despised me. Now you will have to learn what it means to live without me, without my support, without my inheritance. Perhaps then you will understand the value of what you lost." She stood for a few seconds, as if she expected me to break down, to repent, to run and hug her. But I didn't. I stood tall with my head held high, showing her that the invisible woman no longer existed. Finally, she slammed the door, and her fury was trapped in the walls while I was left at peace. Over time, my resolve began to bear fruit. The foundation I created opened its doors. Children who had never had a home found shelter. Women who had been silenced found their voices again. And I, seeing their faces light up, understood that this was the true legacy I wanted to leave. Not riches stained by deceit, not the empty titles of a broken family, but something that truly transformed lives. Sometimes at night I think of my daughter. I wonder if she will ever understand that what I did wasn't out of hate, but out of justice. Maybe one day she will understand, maybe never. I don't care anymore. My life can't continue to revolve around her contempt. Now it revolves around something bigger, my restored dignity. I look in the mirror and no longer see the broken woman who begged for love. I see someone who survived humiliation, who walked among the shadows and knew how to wait for the moment to rise. And although I know that loneliness will continue to accompany me, it doesn't scare me. I prefer dignified solitude to poisoned company. That is my true triumph. That when they talk about me, they don't remember me as the forgotten mother, but as the woman who refused to be erased, who transformed pain into justice, and who, even wounded, knew how to rise again. That is my legacy.